welcome to my presentation on interviews. What are interviews for data collection? I found a definition of interviews, which is conversations between the teacher and researcher and participants in the study in which the teacher poses a question. I found this from Dana. Interviews also are good because they capture the naturally occurring talk that happens throughout conversation, as well as informal, spontaneous, or thoughtfully planned, are also different ways that the interviews are executed. And lastly, the interviews can be conducted individually or in a group. There are several types of interviews from Mertler that I found. The first one is a structured interview. In this interview, a guide of predetermined questions are used to structure the interview process. Next, we have a semi-structured interview in which the researcher asks the base questions, but then follows up with alternative questions as they proceed throughout the interview. Next is an open-ended interview. The researcher asks a few broad questions and will continue to try to get information out of the interviewee as the process goes along. Continued is a focus group interview. This is simultaneously interviewing a small group of people, generally 10 to 12 max, for about 1 to 2 hours. And lastly, an informal interview, which happens spontaneously, that kind of takes place throughout the data collection process, and are just part of those daily interactions that you have with people. Why use interviews? Interviews are a very useful method for data collection. It helps to investigate the issues that you're researching in an in-depth way. It discovers how the individuals think and feel about a topic and why they hold certain topics, and what opinion they hold on certain topics. It allows you to investigate the effectiveness or usefulness of your research. It also helps to inform decision-making and do strategic planning based upon what you're interviewing for. Interviews can be a good way to get the impersonal data by kind of watching the people as you're interviewing them, watching their actions, characteristics, expressions, body language. And interviews are also a really good way to deepen understanding and explain statistical data that you're trying to research. Is interviews a qualitative or quantitative technique? From Blackstone, I found that qualitative interviews are most effective, but there also are quantitative. In qualitative interviews, it involves one opportunity to learn about things that cannot necessarily be seen in the process. Usually it's semi-structured, has open-ended questions, has that conversational piece, and the goal of this interview is to kind of find out what the interviewee thinks is important. In a quantitative interview, it's more standardized, and the questions and answer options are given to the interviewee, so they have to respond with the options they are given. There's usually a schedule that goes along with it, and it also kind of gathers data from a larger perspective. Some of the positives that I found from Blackstone: in qualitative interviews, it gathers detailed information. It gives you the participant's viewpoint, and it allows you to do those observations when interviewing is done orally and face-to-face with a person, to read their expressions and their body language. In a quantitative interview, usually there's higher response rate than surveys. Surveys, you don't always get them back. They can be skewed because with those surveys, the research or the interviewees might not necessarily know what the questions are asking them. So it kind of gives you that opportunity in an interview to reduce that skewed data, because you are there to be able to clarify those opportunities for those people. There are some limitations as well to interviews found by Blackstone. In qualitative interviews, it's what people do versus what they say they do can be different. Some people say they're doing one thing, but what they actually do or implement is actually different. It's very time consuming to plan it out and figure out what you want to do for that. It can be very tedious as well and expensive if you need to buy materials to incorporate these interviews with. For quantitative, the limitations include the interviewer effect, which is when the interviewer themselves are affecting the response of the interviewee because of their expression, the way they word the questions, their own thoughts or feelings are kind of going into this interview, which is not good. Consistency also is an issue with the quantitative, and as well as sometimes it can be a smaller sample of people, so you don't really get the number you need for the data. Overall, my takeaway for the limitations from Mertler, it is very time consuming no matter what you do. You have to plan it out. It's also, you have to provide the interviewee's anonymity at all times, and that could lead to ethical issues if you do not. So sometimes you can't always present all the data that you would like. Interviewees sometimes feel what they say can be used against them, so you might not always get that conversation that you want out of them. And the researcher must make the interviewee feel comfortable about what they collected, because like I said, sometimes they just feel like what they're saying can be used against them, especially if it's being recorded. They might not feel comfortable. And sometimes when conducting focus group interviews, it can yield to opinions because you start to have that conversation with a small group of people and people start to add their opinions in it. So that's kind of a thing that you need to be careful of when interviewing in focus groups. As far as the validity and reliability of interviews, I talked about the interviewer effect from Blackstone, with the interviewer themselves influences the interviewee's responses because of their expressions, body language, the way they word it. They put their own feelings and emotions into it. Also, as the interview structure decreases, so does the reliability. So the less structured your interview is, the less reliable it is. It's hard to kind of keep that same structure throughout all of the interviews that would be conducted, because it's not if it's not as structured, then you can't always recreate what was done, and it's harder to compare that in the long run. Also, the interactive nature of the interview can lead to various biases and limits impact on human decision making. Just the interaction between people limits sometimes what the interviewee might want to say. As far as ethics go, the two big ones that I see with interviews is the confidentiality of interviews information at all times, because you have to have the confidentiality at all times throughout your research process. And I know sometimes when you're conducting the interviews, there's probably some things that you would want to share that probably is not ethical to actually share that, unfortunately. Also, it is important to get the permission from the interviewee ahead of time so they know exactly what is going to go into the paper and there's no surprises. Otherwise, that will lead to also ethical issues. And lastly, why interviews are unique is because it really gives you that ability to have an in-depth conversation with that person and read their thoughts, feelings, and actions by giving them that interview in person. It captures that naturally occurring talk that happens when people are face-to-face. Additionally, interviews are good because they can be informal, spontaneous, or thoughtfully planned, so they can happen really at any time to get the data you need, as well as they can also be conducted individually or in a group, so that also would help compare data. And the last slide is my references. Thank you for watching.